1944. A German tank sits motionless at the edge of a field, undamaged, its armor unbreached, its guns still deadly, its crew still alive and able. It is one of the finest fighting machines in the world, and it has not been defeated in battle. It has been defeated by something far simpler and far more absolute. Its fuel tank is empty, and there is no more fuel coming. The crew will do what thousands of German crews did in the last years of the war. They will strip what they can, set demolition charges or simply disable the engine, and abandon their magnificent tank, not because the enemy destroyed it, but because they could not feed it. And a few fields away, or a few days later, American tanks will roll past the abandoned German machine, and they will not stop, and they will not run dry, because behind them flows a river of fuel that never seems to end. If you were that German tank commander, standing beside your abandoned tank with an empty fuel tank and a full magazine, the bitterness of it would be hard to describe. Your tank was better than the enemy's tanks in a straight fight. You knew it. The enemy knew it. And it did not matter, because a tank that cannot move is not a tank at all. It is a stationary pillbox at best, and a pile of abandoned steel at worst. All the armor and all the firepower in the world are useless without the fuel to carry them to the battle. And you did not have the fuel, and the enemy had so much that his tanks seemed never to run out. This is one of the deepest and most decisive truths of the entire war, and it is one of the least understood, because it is not about the tanks at all. The story of the war is usually told in terms of the machines, whose tank was better, whose gun was bigger, whose armor was thicker. And by many of those measures, the Germans often won. But the machines are only half the story, and often the less important half, because a weapon is only as good as your ability to fuel it, supply it, and keep it running. And in the matter of fuel, the most basic requirement of any mechanized force, the imbalance between the two sides was so total that it decided the outcome regardless of how good the tanks themselves were. This is not a story about tanks. This is a forensic audit of fuel, of why the German war machine was chronically, catastrophically short of it, and why the American war machine had so much that its tanks never ran dry, and of how that single imbalance, more than any tank or gun, determined which side could actually move, fight, and win. Part 1. The German Calculus. To understand why German tanks ran out of fuel, you have to understand the German fuel situation, and it is one of the most important and most crippling facts of the entire German war effort. A weakness so fundamental that it undermined everything else. Germany had a catastrophic strategic problem. It had almost no domestic oil. Oil is the lifeblood of a mechanized military. It fuels the tanks, the trucks, the aircraft, the ships, everything that moves. And Germany, unlike the United States, did not sit on great reserves of it. Germany had to get its oil from somewhere, and the somewheres were all precarious. There was a limited supply from within its sphere. Most importantly, the oil fields of Romania, which became absolutely vital to the German war effort. And there was synthetic fuel, an extraordinary technical achievement in which Germany manufactured liquid fuel from coal, of which it had plenty. The synthetic fuel program was a genuine marvel of chemistry and industry, and it kept Germany fighting far longer than its natural oil supply alone would have allowed. But both of these sources were fundamentally inadequate and desperately vulnerable. The natural oil, from Romania and elsewhere, was never enough and could be lost. And it was lost, as the war turned and those sources were overrun or bombed. And the synthetic fuel plants, for all their ingenuity, could never produce enough to meet the full demand. And worse, they were large, fixed, identifiable industrial targets, and as the Allied bombing campaign turned its attention to them, they were systematically attacked and their output devastated. By the later war, the German fuel situation was not just tight, it was collapsing. And the consequences of this fuel starvation reached into every part of the German war machine, and they were crippling in ways that had nothing to do with the quality of German equipment. Aircraft could not fly enough because there was no fuel to train pilots or mount operations. Tanks and vehicles sat idle for want of fuel. Operations were planned around the desperate scarcity of fuel, and sometimes could not be conducted at all. The magnificent German tanks, the Tigers and Panthers we have discussed, were, in the later war, frequently immobilized not by the enemy, but by empty fuel tanks. German crews abandoned undamaged tanks in enormous numbers, simply because there was no fuel to move them. A significant proportion of German tank losses in the later war were not combat losses at all. They were tanks abandoned or destroyed by their own crews for lack of fuel, or because they could not be moved to safety when a position had to be given up. And this was not only a late-war problem, though it grew worse at the end. The fuel constraint had shaped German operations for years. In North Africa, German mobile operations lived and died by fuel, and the campaign was repeatedly crippled when fuel failed to arrive across the Mediterranean, so that armored formations that had won their battles could not exploit their victories because they had no fuel to advance. On the Eastern Front, the vast distances and the desperate fuel situation meant that German mechanized forces were perpetually constrained by how far their fuel could carry them. Again and again, across every theater, the same pattern repeated. German arms would achieve a tactical success and then be unable to exploit it because the fuel to continue simply was not there. The fuel shortage did not just cost individual tanks, it robbed the entire German war effort of the ability to turn its battlefield victories into decisive results. There is no more bitter illustration of this than the great German offensive in the Ardennes in the winter of 1944, the last major German attack in the West. That offensive was launched with fuel reserves so inadequate that the German plan actually depended on capturing American fuel dumps to keep the advance going. Think about what that means. The German army launched its last great offensive without enough fuel to complete it, gambling on seizing the enemy's fuel to continue. And when the advance stalled and the captured fuel did not materialize as hoped, German tanks and vehicles ran dry and were abandoned across the battlefield, the offensive grinding to a halt, as much from empty fuel tanks as from enemy resistance. The finest tanks in the world, halted not by superior enemy armor, but by the simple, absolute fact of having no fuel. That is the German calculus. A nation with almost no domestic oil, dependent on vulnerable natural sources, and an ingenious but inadequate synthetic fuel program, both of which were being destroyed, so that its magnificent war machine was chronically and catastrophically starved of the one thing every vehicle needs to move, and its finest tanks, undefeated in battle, sat abandoned with empty tanks, because there was no fuel to carry them to the fight or away from it. Now let us look at why the American tanks never ran dry. Part 2. The American answer. The American fuel situation was the exact opposite of the German one, in every respect, and it began with a fact of geology and geography so favorable that it shaped the entire American way of war. The United States had oil in staggering abundance. The United States was, at this time, the greatest oil producer in the world by an enormous margin. It sat on vast reserves, it had a huge and sophisticated petroleum industry, and it produced oil in quantities that dwarfed anything the other combatants could manage. Where Germany scraped and synthesized and rationed every drop, America simply had oil, more than it needed for itself, enough to fuel its own vast military and to supply its allies as well. The foundation of the American fuel advantage was this simple, overwhelming natural and industrial abundance. America had the oil, and Germany did not, and no amount of German ingenuity could overcome that basic fact. But having the oil was only the beginning. The Americans built an extraordinary global system to refine that oil into fuel and deliver it, in the right forms and quantities, to their forces all over the world. This was a logistical achievement of the first order. The tankers that carried fuel across oceans, the pipelines, the storage, the distribution networks, the famous fuel cans, the whole apparatus of getting fuel from American wells to the tank at the front. We have touched on elements of this before, and it was as impressive in its way as the production of the oil itself. Abundance of oil, converted by a sophisticated global logistics system into delivered fuel at the front, meant that the American soldier and the American tank could count on fuel the way they counted on the sunrise. And the consequences of this fuel abundance were the mirror image of the German fuel starvation. American tanks and vehicles could move freely, without the constant, crippling constraint of fuel scarcity. American operations could be planned around what was tactically best, not around the desperate question of whether there was enough fuel to conduct them. American aircraft could fly and train and operate lavishly. The whole American war machine could exploit its mobility to the fullest, because the fuel that mobility required was always there. The American Army was the most mechanized, most mobile army in the world, and it could be that way precisely because it had the fuel to move all those vehicles, all the time, without stint. Consider what this meant in direct contrast to the German experience. When a German offensive had to be planned around inadequate fuel and might stall when the fuel ran out, an American offensive could be sustained by a continuous flow of fuel that kept the tanks and trucks moving as long as the operation required. When German tanks sat abandoned with empty tanks, American tanks rolled on, refueled from an endless supply. When the German army rationed every liter, the American army could be almost profligate, because there was always more. The famous American breakouts and rapid advances, the great sweeping movements that characterized the American way of war in its best moments, were possible only because of fuel abundance, because a mechanized army can only move as far and as fast as its fuel allows, and the American army's fuel allowed it to move almost without limit. And the Americans went to extraordinary lengths to keep the fuel flowing right up to the leading edge of the advance. They laid pipelines across the sea floor and across the liberated countryside to carry fuel forward. They devoted a huge share of their truck transport to hauling fuel to the front. The same great truck convoys we have discussed carried, above all, the fuel that kept the spearheads moving. When the fast-moving American advances outran their supply lines, the single thing that most often limited them was fuel. Not enemy resistance, but the sheer challenge of pushing enough fuel forward, fast enough, to keep the tanks rolling. And the remarkable thing is that this was a problem of abundance, not scarcity. The American difficulty was moving their vast fuel supplies forward quickly enough, while the German difficulty was having any adequate fuel at all. Even the American fuel problems were the problems of a rich army, not a poor one. The contrast could not be sharper. The Americans strained to deliver an abundance of fuel fast enough to their advancing tanks, while the Germans watched their tanks run dry with no more fuel in existence to send them. And here is the deepest point. The Germans built, arguably, the better individual tank. But the Americans built the better system for actually using tanks in war, and the foundation of that system was fuel. A slightly inferior tank that always has fuel is infinitely more useful than a superior tank sitting abandoned with an empty tank. The American tanks never ran dry, and that single fact, unglamorous, invisible, never celebrated, made them more effective instruments of war than the magnificent German tanks that so often could not move. The Germans built tanks that were better in a fight. The Americans built tanks that could always reach the fight and leave it and reach the next one, because behind them flowed an ocean of fuel that the Germans could only dream of. Part 3. The River of Steel. The fuel imbalance connects to the central themes of this channel more directly than almost anything else, because fuel is the most literal possible form of the river of steel, the continuous flow of material without which nothing else matters. It connects, first and most obviously, to the theme that the war was decided by the whole system, not by the individual weapon. Here is the purest possible demonstration. The Germans had the better tank, and it did not matter, because they did not have the fuel to move it. No fact more completely destroys the idea that the war was decided by weapon quality. The finest tank in the world, without fuel, is a pillbox or a scrap heap. The war was decided by the capacity to fuel and supply and move the weapons, and in that capacity, the Americans were overwhelmingly superior, and the empty fuel tank of the abandoned German Panzer is the proof. It connects to the theme of abundance as the foundation of the American way of war. We have traced American abundance through food, ammunition, equipment, and much else. Fuel is perhaps the most strategically decisive form of it, because fuel is what makes a mechanized army mechanized. The American oil abundance was the foundation that made possible the whole mobile, motorized, mechanized American way of war. The trucks, the tanks, the aircraft, all of it running on the fuel that America had and Germany lacked. Every other form of mobility we have discussed rested on this foundation of fuel. It connects to the theme of logistics as the decisive art. Having the oil was necessary, but not sufficient. The Americans also built the global system to deliver it, and that delivery system was as important as the oil itself. This is the same lesson we have found everywhere, that production must be married to delivery, that abundance must be married to logistics, and that the Americans excelled at both. The fuel that reached the American tank at the front was the product of both American oil and American logistics, working together. And it connects to the deepest theme of all, that the unglamorous, invisible, boring necessities of war are the ones that actually decide it. Nobody makes films about fuel. Fuel is the least dramatic thing imaginable, a liquid in a tank, taken utterly for granted when it is there, catastrophic when it is not. And yet fuel, more than almost any weapon, decided the war. The German tanks that sat abandoned with empty tanks, and the American tanks that never ran dry, are the truest possible illustration of the Channel's central argument, that the war was won not by the glamorous weapons, but by the boring, essential, systemic capacity to supply them. And fuel is the most essential and most boring of all. The German tank commander, standing beside his abandoned tank with its empty fuel tank, was standing at the exact point where the whole argument of this channel becomes undeniable. His tank was better, and it was out of fuel. And the enemy's inferior tanks were rolling past, full of fuel, on their way to win the war. Part 4. The German Realization. The German realization about fuel was among the most bitter and most complete of the entire war, because it was so absolute and so impossible to remedy. At the immediate level, German commanders understood the fuel crisis intimately, because it constrained everything they did. They planned operations around fuel scarcity. They watched aircraft sit idle and tanks abandoned for lack of fuel. They knew, in the most practical terms, that the fuel shortage was crippling their ability to fight, regardless of how good their equipment was. This was not an abstract strategic weakness. It was a daily, operational reality that shaped every decision. And German leadership understood the strategic centrality of fuel completely. Indeed, the desperate importance of oil shaped German strategy at the highest levels throughout the war. Major strategic decisions were driven by the need to secure oil, and the vulnerability of the oil supply was understood as a mortal weakness. The Germans knew that their fuel situation was a fundamental, potentially fatal problem, and they devoted enormous effort to addressing it. The synthetic fuel program, the attempts to secure and hold oil-producing regions, the ferocious defense of the synthetic plants against bombing. They understood the problem completely. They simply could not solve it, because the underlying fact that Germany did not have enough oil and could not get enough was beyond their power to change. And the contrast with the enemy sharpened the bitterness. German commanders knew that the Americans had fuel in abundance, that American operations were not constrained by fuel the way theirs were, that American tanks and aircraft could move and fly freely while their own sat idle. When German forces captured American fuel supplies, the abundance they found was a direct, painful illustration of the imbalance. The knowledge that the enemy's inferior tanks could always move while their own superior tanks sat abandoned for lack of fuel was a particularly bitter form of the general realization that ran through the whole war, that German quality was being defeated by American abundance and system. And the deepest German realization was the one this channel arrives at from every direction, and fuel delivers it in its most absolute form. The Germans understood that they had been beaten not because their weapons were inferior, their tanks were often superior, but because they lacked the fundamental material foundation to use those weapons. A tank is only as good as the fuel that moves it, and the Germans did not have the fuel, and no amount of engineering brilliance could compensate for an empty fuel tank. They had built magnificent machines and starved them of the fuel they needed to function, not by choice, but by the iron constraint of a nation without oil, fighting nations that had it in abundance. And in the abandoned German tanks with their empty fuel tanks, the whole tragedy of the German war effort was written. Brilliance, starved of the basic resources it needed, defeated not in battle, but by the simple, absolute lack of the fuel to fight. The German commander, looking at his abandoned tanks, understood that he had been beaten by geology and by logistics, by the enemy's oil and the enemy's ability to deliver it, as much as by anything that happened on the battlefield. And there is no more complete or more humbling realization available to a soldier, that the finest army can be defeated not by a better army, but by the simple, unanswerable fact of running out of the fuel to fight. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle drove a fuel truck, worked in the pipelines and depots, served in the oil industry, or kept the tanks and vehicles fueled and moving at the front, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The men who moved the fuel did some of the most dangerous and least celebrated work of the war. A fuel truck is a rolling bomb, and the men who drove them forward under fire are almost never remembered. But the fuel they delivered was one of the deepest reasons the war was won. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends, and among all the reasons it ended as it did, few are more fundamental or less celebrated than fuel. The simple liquid, without which no tank moves, no aircraft flies, and no mechanized army can fight. So here is the verdict. The German tanks ran out of fuel because Germany had almost no oil. It is that basic. Germany was a great industrial and military power built on a catastrophic strategic weakness, the lack of the one resource that a mechanized military needs above all others. Its ingenious synthetic fuel program and its vulnerable natural oil supply could never produce enough, and both were destroyed as the war turned, so that the German war machine was chronically and finally catastrophically starved of fuel, and its magnificent tanks sat abandoned with empty tanks, undefeated in battle, but unable to move. The American tanks never ran dry, because America had oil in overwhelming abundance and built a global system to deliver it. It is that simple. America was the greatest oil producer in the world, and it married that abundance to a logistical system that delivered fuel to its forces everywhere, so that American tanks and vehicles and aircraft could move and fight and fly without the crippling constraint of fuel scarcity that defined the German experience. And the contrast between the abandoned German tank with its empty fuel tank and the American tank rolling past with fuel to spare is one of the most complete pictures of the war that exists, because it shows, more clearly than any comparison of armor or guns, what actually decided the outcome. The Germans built the better tank. The Americans had the fuel to move theirs. And a tank that can move beats a better tank that cannot. Every time, without exception, because a tank that cannot move is not a weapon at all. The German commander standing beside his abandoned tank understood the whole war in that moment. His machine was superior, and it was useless, because it was out of fuel, and there was no more coming. The enemy's machines were inferior, and they were winning, because they had fuel and always would. And no amount of courage or skill or engineering could change the basic equation, because you cannot fight a war without fuel. And Germany did not have it, and America had more than it could ever use. The Germans built tanks that were better in a fight. The Americans built tanks that never ran out of fuel, and in a mechanized war, the tank that can always move, always reach the battle, always pursue and always withdraw, defeats the better tank that sits abandoned with an empty tank, every single time. The Germans ran out of fuel. The Americans never did. And that, more than any tank or gun or battle, is why one side could keep moving until it won, and the other could only watch its finest machines run dry. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the empty fuel tank. Nobody makes a film about fuel. It is the least dramatic thing in any war. A liquid, invisible, taken for granted when it is there, catastrophic when it is gone. There is no glory in it, no heroism, no story that anyone wants to tell. It is just fuel, in a tank, and either it is there or it is not. And it decided the war as surely as any weapon. The finest tanks in the world sat abandoned in the fields of Europe, undamaged, undefeated, simply out of fuel. while the enemy's lesser tanks rolled past them, full, on their way to victory. All the German brilliance, all the magnificent engineering, all the superior armor and firepower, brought to nothing by an empty fuel tank, and no more fuel coming. Mostly, when an American tank needed fuel, the fuel was there and the tank kept moving, because behind it flowed the oil of a continent, delivered by a system that never ran dry, carrying the American army forward while the German army ran out of gas. They deserve to be remembered, the tanker crews who ran dry through no fault of their own, and the fuel men who kept the other side moving, by the simple, unglamorous, war-deciding truth that a war is won not by the best machines, but by the machines that can actually move, and that the side with the fuel is the side that moves, and the side that moves is the side that wins.